G'day and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, learning from the crisis, Labor proposes thousands of social and affordable homes in their bid for government. Warnings that Israel is on the brink of civil war as the conflict in Gaza shows no signs of abating. And time for the fortress to open. A group of prominent Australians outlines their vision for a world in which we learn to live with COVID. Joining me on the panel, CEO of the Tourism and Transport Forum, Margy Osmond. Always lovely to see you. In Canberra tonight, Special Advisor for Strategic Communications firm Michelson and former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration, Abul Rizvi. Good to see you.
Hi, Ellen.
Hope we're not keeping you from the golf course, judging on your sweater.
Is that working?
Yes. In London, author and writer Nell Frizzell. G'day, Nell. Thanks for coming back on the program. And also in London, incoming President of King's College London, Shitij Kapur.
Thank you for having me.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. It's been a mixed pandemic for Anthony Albanese. The Labor leader has struggled to cut through over the last year, locked out of the National Cabinet while state leaders take the national spotlight. But last night, with one eye on a potential election perhaps later this year, he outlined his vision for a post-COVID Australia.
It would be a disaster if we emerged from this crisis having learned nothing and not changed at all. What a missed opportunity if our economy comes out the other side with nothing to show for this transformational moment, but the biggest debt and deficit of all time.
Now, the cornerstone of this plan is housing, specifically a $10 billion social housing fund to build 30,000 affordable homes for vulnerable Australians and frontline workers.
The security of a roof over one's head should be available to all Australians. Young people despair about whether they will ever afford a first home. Families struggle to meet rent payments, and older women are the fastest growing group subject to homelessness. Our home gave us so much more than somewhere to sleep. It gave my mum and I pride and dignity and security, and it gave me a future that led me here tonight.
This is interesting, Abul, the distinction between the budget and this response to the budget, with Albanese's focus on wages growth, economic inequality, with the government, talking about looking in the out years, what is it, $1.4, $1.7 trillion of debt to keep this economy going till the borders open. How did you read the opposition leader's budget and reply?
I thought him raising the issue of inequality was really important. He raised it in the context of decency and fairness, which is entirely appropriate. But I think we in Australia have to now start talking about inequality in terms of its impact on the economy and the strength of the economy. Over the last 50 to 60 years, we've seen the wages share of GDP steadily decline in this country, almost by about 15 percentage points relative to the share that goes to capital income and profits. Now that raises serious issues in terms of aggregate demand. And let's be clear, we are moving into an era where the key economic challenge will be weak and persistently weak aggregate demand. The ageing of our population will weaken aggregate demand.
So, because you always look at the population figures, right? You always look at the ageing of the population, where are they moving, how many young people are coming through, how does demography work with the economy? Now that's fine because you're a PhD and that's your thing. But if you're an ordinary person sitting looking at this budget response on Thursday night after all that cash on Tuesday night, does that resonate, do you think?
I don't think it would resonate with most of those people. Where they would be looking is in terms of their pay packet, first and foremost. And frankly, their pay packet has not increased for a long, long time, in real terms. And the government is saying over the next 4 years, it won't increase again in real term, which will mean that the wages share of GDP will probably continue to fall. And that long term hurts our economic potential. It hurts the ability of businesses to survive. I mean, employers can say in the short term, well, if I keep wages down, it increases in the short term my profits. And that's true, and that's fine. But look at it collectively over the long term, and I believe what employers are really doing is shooting themselves in the foot by continuing to argue for low wages growth.
Let me turn to you, Margy. I mean, it has been perceived as perhaps on the coalition side, the coalition going with their record of economic management, perhaps those tax cuts, and the Labor side focusing on wages growth. Are they the dimensions of the debate that we're going to see between now and the next election? Is that all we're going to talk about?
Well, I think it depends what audience you're talking about as having that debate. I think there's a big chunk of people this week who would have looked at both speeches and gone, oh my God, we're 12 months potentially off from an election and it just officially kicked off this week.
Is that how it felt? You were down there?
Yeah, I was down in Canberra. I must say it didn't seem quite as festive as a budget night as it normally does. But however, I think it's a case of everybody is bracing themselves for the exhaustion of a never-ending election campaign. I think for me, the other thing that's quite interesting is that the government's approach to this was cornucopia. We're giving you, look at all these lovely things we're going to give you, whereas the Labor Party, I think, as a product of their last election experience, is doling it out drop by drop and may, in fact, do themselves a disservice, because I think if you were going to weigh the two in the back pocket description, the pay packet, or not necessarily the pay packet, I beg your pardon, but the sort of gifts from government perspective, you know, the government looks a lot stronger at this point in time than the Labor Party necessarily does, even though perhaps theirs was a better idea and a better theme.
And to what extent is that just the difficulty of incumbency, regardless of which side of your politics you're on in this country? People are just going, let's just stick with the mob we've got.
I think there's an element of that. I think what complicates that this time round is what's happened with the vaccination rollout and a whole range of other things. I think the polling...
Not that simple.
Not that simple. And I think that the days of being able to predict election campaigns the way we have before, perhaps this is another legacy out of COVID. All things may change.
Well, polling has improved for Labor over the course of this year, but it's clear that if an election were called tomorrow, they would still have quite the hill to climb. And it's a problem that left of centre parties are facing all over the world. Last week, England held local elections where the incumbent Conservatives smashed the opposition Labor. And that's led to some profound reflection across the party, not least of which from former Prime Minister Tony Blair.
The left need to understand that voters do not like their country, flag or history to be disrespected. People like common sense, proportion and reason. They dislike prejudice, but they dislike extremism in combating prejudice. And the battle is being fought on ground defined by the right, because sensible progressives don't want to be on the field at all.
Nell, can I turn to you? Labor changed their national leader and they were thinking that that would do the trick. Look at Boris Johnson. He didn't even comb his hair when the Duke of Edinburgh died, for goodness sakes. Disastrous handling of COVID.
He never does.
He didn't. And yet he's not in any political trouble at all.
I think I similarly look at my political sort of landscape over here and think I genuinely don't understand what the majority of the voting population think anymore. Not that they disagree with me, I just can't predict what's going to happen. And you would think, you know, in a state of sort of crisis where there'd be questions being raised about the Prime Minister's own personal spending and the privatisation of the NHS at a time when they're literally saving our lives, there might be an opportunity for the opposition to really gain headway. And actually, the local elections seem to show that the incumbents have it. And there has been a swing towards the Green movement in this country, which is really, for me, hopeful to see. But it still seems that the majority are happy with the way that the country's being run, and they contribute that success to the government and the Prime Minister, which is up for debate, I'll be honest.
Yeah, because I mean, you would have to say, until you got to the COVID vaccine rollout, the handling of COVID was catastrophic.
Appalling, absolutely appalling at every stage. Slow, half measures, this sort of strange sense of putting the economy above the population, which of course, unfortunately, the economy is driven by the population. So it was a sort of backwards view of the whole thing, in my opinion. But Labour have such a huge hill to climb. And it's interesting, Tony Blair's, I think when he left office, he said he would make occasional inversions into public life. The guy's everywhere. I mean, I see more of him than Keir Starmer at the moment.
Who is the Labor leader. Shitij, it's interesting what Blair is saying. What Blair is saying is, look, you're getting stuck on the Conservatives' turf. That's what he's saying. He said it's not like people don't care about Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion or the rights of transsexual people. It's just if you start to, in the opinion of a kind of centre-right coalition of working class folks and older people and wealthier people, if you start to give them a sense that you're disrespecting the country, the flag and the history of the UK, you'll lose them.
I resonate with that point. I mean, he was talking about the sensible progressives, and I'm drawn back to immediately after the Second World War, when, you know, there was widespread devastation, but the country here in the UK came out of it with perhaps the most ambitious progressive program of ever. You know, the NHS was created after the Second World War as a response to the devastation. So the left or the progressives, whatever you want to call them, have an opportunity to articulate that grand vision of a new, more fair society. You know, whether the 20,000 houses that Albanese announced constitutes that grand vision of a new, fair society is another matter. But I think there is a true opportunity here. And I hope we won't lose that in symbolism. Time will tell.
But when he talks about and he's talking about UK Labor here, right, Shitij? He talks about old-fashioned economic messages that fundamentally understand technological change, but he also talks about new-fashioned social and cultural messages around extreme identity. What does he mean?
I think one should...
I don't think you're the only person saying that, Ellen.
Right.
I genuinely don't know.
You know, he could be hinting about some of the debates. I think the gender identity debate, you know, I'm speculating as to what another man is thinking, which is always a dangerous thing to do. But it would be fair that if you look at the press on the right, the sort of things that exercise them are issues around gender identity is one. It's a very small segment of the overall debate, but I think it's needlessly become a flashpoint, distracting us from the really big social and economic issues.
Do you agree, Nell? Do you agree that you know, there are issues with Boris Johnson taking cash to renovate Number 10.
And potentially to pay for childcare, which is something that I feel very strongly about. If he can't afford childcare, how on earth can I? Right. But I do think, you know, for me, the gender debate is not a debate. If you believe in human rights, you believe in human rights for all. Same with, you know, any racial debate or any class debate. They're not debates. They're just a means to polarise a population that otherwise might unite against the government or against the sort of right-wing agenda. And when we talk about the right-wing sections of the British press, I mean, there's maybe 2 left-wing newspapers left in Great Britain. It is a hugely politically dominated media landscape, which, you know, we have to work within, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. But it's hard to have a reasoned debate about things like identity when there is this huge swathe of, you know, very powerful, celebrated writers and commentators who want to oppose it.
Margy, if you look at the Australian landscape, right, do you think that progressive politicians in Australia are falling for what Blair calls these tactical political traps? Because we see similar debates here, don't we? We saw the debate, if you like, around the meritorious unit citation for troops who'd served in Afghanistan, which was that, you know, collective group decoration. The head of the Defence Force says no after the war crimes allegations came out. The Defence Minister, some call him a culture warrior, said no, let's keep those. We see the $1 billion expansion of the War Memorial when just across the road at the Australian Archives, things are crumbling, moths are eating them. And in your own part of the world, coal miners seen as real Australians, tourism jobs, clean energy jobs aren't seen as real work.
I mean, look, I think it's an interesting thing. I mean, we were talking a minute ago about, you know, people's need to see this as an opportunity to do something big and visionary and to look at how they might be able to change things. I think the problem we've got that's a little different maybe from the Second World War situation is that COVID has forced everybody into this flight to safety. Everybody has gone to the flag. They have gone to the backyard. They have gone back to their family. There's this, you know, huge upsurge, I think, in conservatism that is born from this, you know, need to feel safe, and that sort of seems to reflect it. So what we're seeing with the politicians, I think, is a fairly safe approach at this point in time. They are going for the things that they think the polling is telling them people want, and that is all about conservative safety.
Abul, it's interesting. Blair, with his, typical panache, says to his Labor colleagues, "We will be in the dreary business of fighting with a cause which is unclear, our hands tied behind our back, on a ground we didn't choose, in a battle we can't win, against a foe which doesn't deserve to triumph, and hoping that another defeat will bring the clarity of purpose we should embrace now. It won't." Does any of that apply to the Australian political landscape?
It probably does. I mean, it's slightly different in the Australian context. I think those issues that Blair is referring to are not necessarily being raised by the leadership of the Labor Party, or indeed even sometimes the Greens. Often it's actually, those issues are in fact actually raised by the right-wing media itself. A classic example I remember was a spoof about fairy bread that the Shovel put out. And there was extraordinary outrage in the Murdoch press that government was going to somehow regulate fairy bread and prevent you from calling it fairy bread.
And to be clear, this was a spoof in an undergraduate joking kind of publication.
Exactly, but it was on national media across the Murdoch media,
right,
where we were being told, they're coming after your fairy bread. So it's not entirely it's not always the progressives that are raising these issues. Sometimes there's an opportunity for the media itself to beat this stuff up.
Yeah, strange times. For anyone even partially familiar with the situation in the Middle East, what's playing out right now is grimly familiar. 109 people, including at least 28 children, have been killed in Gaza, according to the local health ministry. In Israel, 8 people, including 2 children, have been killed. But the conflict has entered a dangerous new dimension, with Jews and Arabs attacking each other on the streets, prompting warnings from the president that the country is on the verge of civil war.
I don't want any problems, but this area called Nachlat Shimon was for the Jews even before the establishment of the state. This land is Jewish and belongs to us.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it.
We were praying in the mosque. It's amazing. This is a praying place, not for fight.
This is a national battle. They don't want Jews to live in Israel. They say it. Listen to what they say. Listen to what they chant.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the mob violence is a bigger threat to Israel than Gaza rockets.
To the citizens of Israel, I say that I do not care if your blood is boiling. You cannot take the law into your own hands. You cannot grab an ordinary Arab citizen and try to lynch him, just as we cannot watch Arab citizens do this to Jewish citizens.
But Israel's opposition leader has accused Mr Netanyahu of leading the nation to anarchy.
The situation won't change if we don't change it. The reality won't get better by itself. The role of leaders is to create a better reality. We have to do everything possible to form a government in Israel as fast as possible with anyone who believes in law and order and shared life.
Palestinian leaders have dismissed talk of a civil war, saying it's a distraction from the root causes of the conflict: violence against Palestinian protesters in Jerusalem earlier this week and continued provocation from right-wing Israeli settlers. For more on this, we're joined in Jerusalem by Middle East correspondent for The Independent, Bel Trew. Bel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What seems to mark out this conflict is that community-level, street-level violence, that civil unrest between Jewish and Arab neighbours within Israel itself. Talk to me about that.
Well, absolutely. I've been in some of those towns where we've seen these explosions of unrest between Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel. And it really feels like you've got a conflict within a conflict, a war within a war right now. And unfortunately, that's going to mean that even if there is a ceasefire between the militants in Gaza and the Israeli military, that's not going to see an end to the violence here in Israel. It feels extremely on edge. I mean, there are these kind of grievances, these kinds of clashes have happened over the years, but right now it's kind of reached a boiling point. We've seen horrendous footage of lynchings taking place on both sides, stabbings and shootings. And in those cities, like I was in a city, for example, called Lod, the rocket barrages which are falling on the city are almost a sideshow to the real battle, which is between the people.
Yeah. And to be clear, this is unusual in that these are people who live side by side, to go to one another's restaurants, to go to one another's shops. They coexist within the state of Israel.
Yes, they do coexist geographically, but I think if you were to speak to some of the sort of Arab citizens of Israel, the communities, they would say that they feel that they are discriminated against in terms of both in their day-to-day existence, in terms of things like infrastructure or building permits, and also just on a kind of legal level, ever since the 2018 nation-state law, which has a constitution-like basis and basically made Israel a Jewish state and downgraded the importance of Arabic as a language to just a secondary language. So speaking to Arab citizens of Israel, they say that they are discriminated against and they are second-class citizens. So although they live side by side geographically with the Jewish population, they would say that they are not equal. Now, on the other side, speaking to sort of police officials and also municipality officials, so Jewish Israelis, they say that that's not the case, that everyone has equal rights, and that in fact the Arab citizens of Israel are often the ones who instigate the violence. So, but we are looking at years and years and years of a situation where there aren't equal rights. That's enshrined in law, and that's bubbled over the years and then reached a kind of crescendo over the last few weeks and then dissolved into these horrendous scenes of violence, basically.
And to what extent, fill me in on the political background. I mean, Netanyahu has been accused of years of incitement, and we see in the introduction that I read, Palestinian leaders talking about provocation from right-wing Israeli settlers. Talk to me about Netanyahu's role, because we did see that he's saying, he's come out very clearly now and said there will be no lynching in the streets.
Well, speaking to Palestinian and Israeli experts on this, they tell me that this has got its roots in provocations from the Israeli right. And Netanyahu, of course, is a leader in the Israeli right movement. They said that this is, accumulation of there being incitements against the Arab population, the demonization of the Arab population, and then on the ground in terms of unfair allocation of resources and infrastructure. And then also just the allowing of extreme groups to be able to organize. So over the last few days, some Israeli monitoring groups have talked about Telegram groups and Facebook groups being used by extremist Jewish factions to mobilize and attack Arab communities. And we've seen that play out in literal terms in terms of, lynchings and mob violence. So there is that side of it in the sense that, there's a right-wing, more extreme view is more permitted in Israel. And I will say on the other side of that, speaking to police officials, I spoke to a spokesperson of the police, Mickey Rosenfeld. He told me that he does not agree with that opinion. He believes that most of the violence is instigated by the Arab community. But it's hard to sort of see that actually backed up in terms of evidence, given the number of instances we've seen of the Arab community here being attacked.
So you've got this terrifying situation on the community level. We saw the suffering within Gaza there, and then the rockets coming the other way, meeting a stronger technological resistance to prevent most of those rockets coming into Israel, but obviously not all. The UN's calling for an immediate ceasefire, but there is no clear idea about whether or not Israel is contemplating a ground invasion against Hamas. What's your reading of that tonight?
Well, we had a sort of a very confusing moment a few hours ago when a tweet was put out in English suggesting that they might have had troops in Gaza. That was later clarified by the Israeli army, saying that they had ground troops involved in an operation, but they were firmly on the Israeli side of the border crossing. It's something that is certainly could be on the cards. The Israeli military said yesterday that they were drafting plans for a ground invasion that they would then get approved and then pass on to the politicians. That does not mean that it's an inevitability. It just means that they're one step closer for that to be able to happen. They have amassed troops along the Gaza border, but not necessarily the same amount that you would have seen in the 2014 war. So I think for the Israeli side, at least speaking to military officials, they're using it as a potential backup plan. It's there. It can be used if things escalate. But I don't think either side wants this to happen. When the ground invasion happened in 2014, it was devastating to both sides, particularly to the civilians in Gaza. The death toll was huge. It's a major step to take. There would be a huge international backlash against Israel for it, because it would be the beginning of an all-out war. And the last time that happened in 2014, it lasted for 7 weeks. And as I said, it was devastating, particularly for civilians on both sides of those border fences.
Thank you so much for updating us, Bel. We do appreciate your time tonight. Bel Trew is the Middle East correspondent for The Independent. The Olympics is a celebration of human endeavour and physical mastery. It's also where we gather in living rooms across the globe and for 2 weeks every 4 years become armchair experts on activities like this.
Next up is China's Luna Fu. In her 5th jump here, a beautiful jump.
There is something absolutely marvellous about the triple jump, an excitement I never quite feel for the simple long jump, but I digress. This year's Tokyo Olympics will be very strange indeed if it goes ahead at all. International spectators banned, locals may not be able to attend either, and a recent poll found that nearly 60% of people in Japan want the Games cancelled altogether. Get those pesky tourists out, get the athletes out, all of you go away. With 7,500 cases in Japan a day, even a tourist operator would be sympathetic, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, I have one other thing I need to say, though. The prospect of how excited you might be about the hurdles is really, slightly concerning.
Oh, it is wonderful. It's sort of a hop, skip and a jump. And I love that when you start watching it, you have absolutely no idea. And by the time you get to the finals, you're a complete expert. Did you see that triple jump?
Yeah, you may have turned me to golf.
No. Yeah. It's wonderful. And sometimes you wonder whether they've got too much height. No, you need to be horizontal, not vertical. No?
I've created a monster.
Nothing?
Yeah.
Wrestling? Fencing?
Swimming?
Yes.
Anyway, the Japanese. Yes, look, I think this just comes back to what we were talking about before. It's this flight to conservatism. And I think also there may very well be something within the Japanese psyche that feels it is just an inappropriate, exuberance at a time when more appropriately things should be restrained and a bit, contained within the community. I think it's a great shame because, as you rightly point out, the Olympics at its best is a time of great hope, joy, amazing heroism, tremendous outcomes, real humanity. We get everything in the space of a couple of weeks, and that's wonderful. I hope that's what we get this time round. I think the cancellation of the Olympics in some ways would send a much bigger and more dampening message globally than perhaps people are giving it credit for at the moment.
Shitij, it's interesting how different cultures cope with risk, right? You and I have spoken about this before. So I talked to my colleagues in the sports department, and the requirements for commentators going over, reporters, athletes, there are bubbles and then bubbles within bubbles, and if this bubble mixes with that bubble, then everybody locks down. I mean, they've kind of got it sorted, it would seem, and yet the people are saying no.
Well, I think it's worth reflecting. We did have the Australian Open. And I think it had a remarkably... I was in Melbourne at that point in time, even had the pleasure of seeing one of the games. It had a remarkably uplifting effect on everyone. And I have to say, even at that point in time, the sentiment in Melbourne was split. There were some people who were saying, look, we're in the midst of a pandemic. Do we really need to do this? Now, my sense is, even though Olympics looks huge, without overseas visitors, the total number of athletes is 10,000. Let's say there's, 2 extra people per athlete. You're talking about 30,000 people. From a medical point of view, this should be manageable with the advance notice that we have, particularly in a country that isn't a zero-case territory. So you see, it would be a different thing if you're trying to organize it in Australia and afraid that 3 new cases of some variant might come in. Look, Japan's having 7,000 cases. This can be managed. It could potentially add 10, 20, 30 cases, but I don't think it'll lead to another epidemic. But that, of course, is the view of someone who wants to join the spectacle and want to see the world uplifting. If I was a resident of Tokyo, I might feel differently.
Yeah. I don't know. Abul, I want to watch the sport.
We wouldn't have guessed that.
I really do. I want to sit on the couch. I want to learn about how to make points in wrestling. I really do.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Ellen, and I would love to watch it as well. But I think Shitij is right. If you were sitting in Tokyo with the 7,000 or whatever it is cases per day, and only a vaccination rate, I think I read somewhere only about 2% so far.
Really?
It sounds really bad. It sounds comparable to Australia, it seems. I find it extraordinary that the vaccination rate in Japan has moved so slowly, given that they knew they wanted the Olympics to proceed. So I can understand why the Tokyo population is scared.
Yeah. Okay, Nell, if we have to watch it on YouTube, what are you looking up?
What would I be watching? I mean, the swimming, I always loved that man who, was he from Cameroon, who ended up doing that incredibly long swim on his own?
Is it Eric?
Will forever be my Olympics hero. But I was in London during the 2012 Olympics, and I would have been absolutely terrified if that had taken place during a pandemic. Whatever we're saying, 30,000 people, that's a lot of people when you are already feeling, in a state of caution and anxiety about your health and that of your vulnerable family. I do think, for me personally, I have sort of long, but after reading about the 1948 Olympics in London, where the greatest case of doping was people taking Horlicks tablets to give them extra sugar. I think that we should have 2 Olympics. I think we should have the clean Olympics, and then you should have the doped Olympics, where you're allowed to take any performance-enhancing drugs you can find, and we'll just see what these people can do when they're when they're really pumped up. Let them go, let them fly. So that's what I would want to watch. I'd want, when things have calmed down and we have a vaccination rate that is safe, and the host nation feel comfortable and the host city would feel comfortable, let's have the human growth hormone Olympics, and I will be watching that.
We Australians could be really kind and let anyone who can't really swim wear floaties.
Yes, absolutely right.
Yeah.
But listen, I would say this about the Olympics. One of the things that always happens, and I remember this from Sydney, and I'm sure it happened in London as well, there's this point where everybody goes, we don't really want the Olympics to come here. It's all such a drama.
That's right.
It's a pain, pain, pain. And then about a week out, something magical happens, and everybody goes, oh, we're so looking forward to this. And then you have all of these people who go, I wish I hadn't left town because it was clearly amazing. So there may also be a little element of that natural kind of process that happens with the Olympics happening
The Japanese government seems very determined to push ahead with it, despite 60% of people in Japan saying no, no, no. You are watching The Drum with me on the panel, CEO of the Tourism and Transport Forum, Margy Osmond, in Canberra, Special Advisor for Strategic Communications firm Michelson Alexander, and former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration, Abul Rizvi. In London, author and writer Nell Frizzell, and also in London, the incoming President of King's College London, Shitij Kapur. On Tuesday evening, at the same moment that the Treasurer was delivering a budget that assumes Australia's borders will stay closed until at least mid-2022, the Queen was opening the UK Parliament and outlining her government's priorities for the coming years. Among them, a commitment to open up international borders and resume international travel as quickly as possible. Here is the UK Transport Secretary.
We want a summer in which, with the help of vaccines and testings, we can reunite families and friends, travel to places we love. We want to start looking outward again. Whilst COVID has isolated us, travel reunites us, even if video calls have kept us all connected during the very long lockdowns. There's simply no substitute for human contact.
Margy is quite weeping in this side of the studio, wishing an Australian politician would say that, if only for the sake of the tourism industry. Well, it's not the kind of language we'd expect to hear from our leaders here. We've become accustomed to our isolated existence, almost entirely free from COVID. But according to a group of some of the country's most prominent figures in business, the arts and academia, Australia faces economic pain and reputational harm unless it reopens to the world. And this same group says we need a plan to move the nation from a zero COVID strategy to one of living with COVID.
It shows a majority of people believe that COVID will take at least 5 years to solve, if ever. But the really hard issue in all this is the psychological runway. It's the shift in mindset. We say there's 5 elements to the roadmap to reopening. The first is get vaccinations right, faster, actually explain them more, make it easy to get, deal with vaccine hesitancy head on. Second, we say we need a certification scheme for people coming into and out of Australia. Third, improved border protection through rapid testing. The technology is getting better. Why can't we have some of that? Fourth, scaled up nuanced quarantine. There's already debate going on that anyway, but if you think about it, we all think hotel quarantine is the answer. It's not. Government's put that in place as an emergency measure. And look, the fifth and final thing is sector and place-specific programs to bring people back in. So seasonal workers in agriculture, there's already pilots happening in South Australia. Government and leadership doesn't have to solve everything, but they do have to ask for help, because I think people will line up to help. I mean, this is a national priority. People will do what's required if asked.
I think if you wanted to boil that down, it would be Mr. Morrison, tear down these walls.
Yeah. I'd go with that big time, actually. That'd be great. I mean, I was talking to one of my colleagues in the US early this morning who's involved in the travel industry there. They're talking to the government at the moment about the potential of opening the border between the US and the UK by July.
This year?
This year. And I think the tourism industry here in Australia is just sitting here going, what do you mean the middle of next year with no plan? As exactly we've just heard, you know, where do the international students come in? Where do the skilled workers come in?
So what are they waiting for? You were down in Canberra. Presumably you could have watched the budget on the television, so you were trying to do something else. What are they waiting to see? What constitutes herd immunity? What level of COVID are they willing to live with? What level of vaccination are they after? Do you understand what we're waiting for?
No. And this is the frustrating thing, not just for the tourism industry, but across the board. People want to be able to plan. And while I fully accept that if there's one thing we've learned about COVID, it is the need for agility, because circumstances change all the time and things will alter, things we didn't know that we suddenly find out. But for us, we need to understand when we can start organising for things and letting people book for holidays or.
But have you gone to them
up?
and said, OK, here's a pilot program for our sector, here's how it could work? If somebody wanted to have a longer holiday, they could come and they could quarantine in this way and this is how it'd work.
Business Council of Australia put together a really great agenda for what would happen with the lifting of restrictions, the opening of borders, sorting out the domestic stuff, all geared to aspects of the vaccination process. A terrific plan.
But you don't know what the vaccination rollout is?
We don't now. We did initially, now we don't. And I think the fact that the National Cabinet is basically saying, well, no, we don't think it's a good idea to put a whole lot of, you know, exact dates in there. Well, look, even a month would be helpful. You know, what particular month of the year are we talking about? And I think there's a brand issue here for Australia. We look a bit silly because we don't have this in place. Now, the government might have a terrific plan, they're just not sharing it with anybody at this point in time. And I'm constantly now fielding calls from international tourism operators who are based outside of Australia who just cannot understand why we can't give them some certainty.
Nell, as of Monday... I'm sorry, Shitij, did you want to jump in?
Yes. I think I'm a bit of a poster child for this because I was in Australia, then I travelled to the UK. And I would say we could see this as a scientific, technical matter, but I really think it's a matter of politics and perception. The politics of it is that at the moment, there isn't any pain for the politicians for being conservative in Australia. By conservative, I mean restrictive in terms of travel. Tell me who has suffered for having done that. In fact, the only evidence we've seen is of having people politically benefit from it. So that's the issue of politics. But the other issue is that of perception. I think in Australia, and I was there for the last 18 months or 15 months of the pandemic, we have managed to sell the perception of, let me call it, extreme safety. In the UK, the government botched all of it. It was never able to assure its population any level of safety. But it started this year with a perception of sort of shambolic, and then the vaccination came in, and it has gotten progressively better. So the challenge in Australia is that a government has to now get its citizens more confident with risk.
And these group today, Shitij, and at this point you can put on your hat as a psychiatrist, are talking about metaphorically the building of a psychological runway with as much urgency as we brought to the task of elimination to the task of changing our risk appetite.
Yes.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
What is this?
Ellen, if I might just...
Yeah, Abul, yeah.
Sorry, just quickly in there, I think part of it is also for the government in the lead up to the next election, the fear of making a mistake.
Right.
And I think they just do not want to risk making a mistake, and hence they will proceed with extreme caution.
Now, this is interesting, Nell, because you're here for the UK perspective. Restrictions easing from Monday, where could you go? You could go to Gibraltar. You could go. There's a little list of places you could go. The Falkland Islands, Nell. Lots of very sweet penguins. I looked it up for you, love. May temperatures, maximum 6 degrees, minimum 2. Can't go to Greece or Spain. Yeah, sorry.
A balmy 2 degrees. No, I've obviously been doing my bicep curls in order to hug my mother, which we can now do here.
Can you hug on Monday? Is that right?
Yeah. I'm going to flex my way into it. I might even hug my partner, who I've been living with for the last 2 years.
So you haven't been able to hug right up until now, is that right?
I think it's different in Scotland and it's different in England, but the social distancing advice has been not to, unless you bubble up with somebody. But in terms of transport and travel and tourism, as someone who lived underneath the flight path of 2 major airports in London, I'm actually quite happy that there have been fewer flights. And of course, I miss Europe enormously, and I would be very keen to be able to get on a train and to go to France or to go to Italy and see another culture, eat some different food. But I'm actually going to be as happy going to Wales or to Cornwall or to the Hebrides. I don't necessarily need to leave the UK for that. We're very lucky here that we have. We have a sort of range of things that is amazing to me. So you can speak to people from the UK who have travelled all around Southeast Asia and all around the Antipodes, and they've never been to the South Coast, they've never been to Scarborough, they've never been to Grimsby, they've never been to Scotland. People don't travel within Britain as much as I think they should.
So you interestingly, where at the height of the pandemic in the UK, you really could go anywhere. You could go to the States, you could go, and now you've got this traffic light system where in the green section you have Israel, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, and
Australia.
No, I don't think that's on the list.
Yes.
We won't let you in.
You just can't come.
That's hypothetical.
It's hypothetical. We're acceptable. You just can't come here.
Yeah, you can come here, but you can't come here.
That's it. Yeah.
And there are orange and red. Like you absolutely cannot go to Turkey unless you quarantine on the way back. Is that the state of affairs?
I mean, the quarantine situation here has been absolutely dire. I mean, Shitij will know more than me about this, but I could not believe at the time when I wasn't able to hug my mother, and I, couldn't go to a library and I couldn't go to a museum. People could fly in from all over the world and just walk through the doors of Britain and get on with things. It was unbelievable.
Crazy.
Shitij, I'm interested in your international students, right? There's an article in the Sydney Morning Herald here saying UK universities snapping up our international students. Excuse me, enrolments hit a record high, up 17%. And Alexander Downer, who's at King's College, says he reckons that your increase of 7% in Chinese students, those students may well have come to Australia had they not gone to you.
Yes. And look, I think the real thing we need to keep in mind is that the British academic cycle for colleges entails an admission somewhere in September, and students show up late September and October. So in some sense, these are enrollments, and they're driven by perception. And the perception amongst students at the moment is that the UK will be open and Australia for sure is closed. So, what decision would you make? Were you a student sitting in Shanghai, had two wonderful universities in mind, and you knew that Australia for sure will be closed and UK likely will be open? And I think that's what we are seeing. But what I'm pointing out is that this is in some sense perception. Things may happen over the summer. Life may be very different in September. But I think Alexander's right. At the moment, that is the way the winds are blowing.
And so what do you say to the government about students coming in from high-risk countries? Or what do you say to the government about, is there a testing regime for the students? Do they have to quarantine?
Look, I think if the government was willing to entail a little bit of risk, it would be very feasible to put in an organised programme of entry.
You're talking Australia now?
The government, yes. But if the government has no appetite for risk, then frankly, you don't leave yourself any room for manoeuvre. But I think we know enough about how to do these things safely to where we can bring it down to a very small element of risk. But look, if you scare the population that a single case of an Indian variant would be a disaster for the nation, and there may be good reasons to think like that, well, then you don't really leave yourself an option.
But explain to me just briefly, because I want to go to Abul, what does a student coming in to King's College from South Africa have to do to get into the country?
Okay. Yes. So at the moment, you probably couldn't come from South Africa because it would be I'm saying generally a country, if it's classified red, unless you're a UK citizen, you cannot travel back. If it's not classified red, then you can travel, but you've got to go through a quarantine arrangement. And of course, if it's classified green, you can come in through with just testing without a quarantine. So these things are changing, and by June 17th, one expects a further change in the way the system would work. So, for example, at the moment, India is classified as red, and I don't think a student would be free to come through. But this is where perception is important. There is a perception that UK is more open to this, and people are hoping that by September and October, the situation will change.
And Nell, is there anxiety among the population, just briefly, in the UK about international students coming in, as there would be in Australia?
I think a lot of us are frightened of students, full stop. Someone who's grew up in a small student town, that feeling of being overwhelmed by young, beautiful people who are drinking too much and throwing up is quite scary wherever they're born.
Oh, come on, we'll make your streets colourful now.
Yeah. Abul, it's interesting, isn't it? Where we were listening to the UK Transport Minister go, families don't respect international borders. That's not how it works anymore. And we saw our West Australian Premier saying a week or two back, why would you want to go home in inverted commas to India, where you no longer are a citizen, for a wedding or to hold the hand of your loved one? This has been an extraordinary thing, hasn't it, to understand that people don't exist in one country.
Exactly. And it's a very short-sighted statement. I mean, perhaps it had an element of politics in it. But with a country where 30% of the population is born overseas, that was a somewhat silly statement. I have to say, though, in respect of students and other people who are offshore, there are still applications being made in sizable numbers. Visas are being processed, visas are being granted, including to students, I think a few thousand a month still, offshore students. So they're all banking up. And the expectation is at some stage, something will happen and it'll open up. But at the moment, the additional student visas we've granted offshore over the last 12 months is sizable.
And you've explained earlier this week to this program that we desperately need these students because once they get their qualifications or postgraduate qualifications, we snaffle them up and keep them here in Australia because they're our skilled migrants. So what's your message to Dr Kapur on the other side of the screen there, who's come from Melbourne to London and he's stealing all our potential Aussies?
Well, we seem to be in Australia, I think, shifting ground a little in that the message we're sending in terms of to our students, our overseas students who come to Australia, is that the primary purpose of a student visa now appears to be full work rights.
Yeah.
Including in the hospitality industry.
Yes, please.
And study.
Well, see, Margy's saying...
I'm going, yes, please.
Margy's saying, yes, please, but you're saying... That's not what a student is about.
I have serious concerns. I mean, I can understand the short-term desire, but I have serious concerns about the message we're sending. So Shitij's university is sending the message, you come to England and you study a quality degree where studying full-time is hard. You come to Australia, you work, 40, 50, 60 hours a week in the hospitality industry, and you study when you can. Yeah. That's the wrong message for the future of our international education industry.
Ellen, you've just reminded me of when my aunt, who is, as we said, the mayor of Rotorua, came to visit us in London, and she would walk around pubs and parks, and I'm going to do the accent, marching up to anyone with a vaguely Southern Hemisphere accent, going, "You need to go back home. We've educated you. You need to go back home." No, it was absolutely humiliating. But she was really cross that all these young, vibrant, intelligent, educated people were coming over and working in pubs in London rather than picking up a career back where they'd, gone to school and been born.
It's a great lark, Nell. It's a great lark in Australia. We have all these wonderful people from around the world, and somebody else has straightened their teeth and educated them and taken out their appendix, and here they all are rocking up paying taxes in Australia. It works a treat. So while for most of us it won't be possible to live out our travel fantasies, we can still ask the question, where would you rather be? Well, for many Australians, that place appears to be Queensland. According to budget forecasts, the Sunshine State's population will grow by 250,000 people over the next 4 years. Next year, Treasury predicts that more than 15,000 of those people will be from New South Wales and 1,200 from Victoria. Let me start with you, Nell, in terms of where you'd rather be. You've explained that your aunt, Stephanie, known to all as Steve Frizzell, is the mayor of Rotorua. Uncle Dick is a very well-known artist. And you yourself went on a little Antipodean adventure, didn't you? Let's have a little look. You called yourself... What are we looking at here, Nell? I know the picture on the left is the Hobbit. What are you there with your spoon?
I am there, actually. I'm wearing my Uncle Dick's jacket and I think a towel around my neck and holding my Auntie Jude's ladle because I just arrived in Auckland and I was sleeping in their granny flat and I wanted to make this. I have a silly blog where I recreate famous photos using paraphernalia from around my house, and they were very sweet to let me do it. And they, like so many people before, allowed their sort of poorer, dirtier, poorly toothed cousins from the UK to rock up and stay in their home, and it was absolutely magic. And I was joking before about how there was a period, during, was it our spring, where, we were only allowed to leave the house for exercise for, a couple of hours a day, and we were terrified of going into the supermarket. And I'd look at pictures from my family in New Zealand, and they were at football games, having picnics, going surfing. And I did think, I've got this New Zealand passport. If I'm not there now, nothing is going to, if I haven't made the jump now, will I ever do it? Because, it does seem and I think there is an unfortunate sort of habit now in the UK of seeing New Zealand and Australia as this little sort of magical place down under where we can all escape to, and we've absolutely ruined our little part of the Northern Hemisphere. And I find that very distasteful. Wealthy people buying up huge chunks of land in a country that they have done nothing to support otherwise. But my God, I'd like to have a little batch somewhere, near a lake or the beach. Would be pretty nice.
Yeah. But it's interesting. The last time you were on, you talked about your new book, The Panic Years, which was a book that attempted to give a name to those years between adolescence and menopause, in which all those interrelated decisions you make about jobs and relationships and babies, and you called it the flux. And I wonder whether COVID isn't a part of the flux, and it makes people think, where do I want to be?
Huge, absolutely huge. I think that sense of being the whole experience of being locked down and having to question, within the confines of these four walls, who you are and what you want from your life has caused loads of people to question whether they really want to be where they're living. Also, the rise in remote learning that has been turbocharged over the pandemic, and brilliantly so, has made us realise that actually we could, my job, I don't need to be in a city to do my job. As long as I've got a good Wi-Fi connection and a toothbrush, I could probably work anywhere.
And yet,
I'm coming for you.
We'll let you in. We'll make an exception. Come via New Zealand. Shitij, at the same time, people want face-to-face learning. That's why they're flocking to King's College. That's why they're flocking to London, to Oxford, to Cambridge. They want face-to-face learning. They don't want a remote experience. That could be the only reason they're coming to you.
Well, I think, Nell, you're quite right in saying you can do your work from anywhere, but I think the qualitative nature of it is still different. And in the last few weeks, having experienced both, side by side, I can tell you there is something special. It's taken millennia for us to get used to seeing each other face to face, and just about 12 months of Zoom or Teams is not going to change it. So I think face-to-face education is not going to go away, but it will need to coexist with this new model. And I think finding that blend is what the challenge for universities, but frankly, even offices is going to be. So let me give an example. In Melbourne, we used to often fly to Canberra for that 1-hour meeting, and it just takes pretty much half the day, or even almost sometimes the day. That seems overdone to me right now. I don't think we'll be doing that anymore. But then there were events where one would go somewhere for a day or two. I think those can't be replaced by Zoom or Teams. So we'll find that right mix.
Well, we're nearly out of time. It seems like the big conversation after real estate, which is, the first conversation you have in Sydney, sorry, Nell, this is the reality, is let's get out of Sydney. Are you hearing that a lot? Abul, where everyone's going to Mollymook or something, Queensland?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Certainly all the retirees are heading to coastal villages around the country. And my wife and I, for the Canberra winter, will obviously be heading north to get away from the Canberra winter. So, the warmer climes are always attractive, I suppose.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, this is an extraordinary internal migration. You can't go anywhere but New Zealand at the moment. But everybody is starting to have that conversation. Where do I really want to be? Where do I really want to live?
Yeah, well, I think it tells you a whole lot of interesting things when you look at property prices up and down the coast. But I tell you, the other one that's really interesting at the moment is the level of personal administration. Not only are people saying, where do I want to be? They're saying, oh my God, I need to sort my life out.
Yes.
I reckon accountants and brokers and anybody in that space, divorce lawyers, everybody's getting their lives sorted out. All of my friends are doing it.
The COVID cleanse brings the
COVID cleanse.
What a lovely panel. Thank you so much for joining us. To Margy, Osmond, Abul, Rizvi, Nell Frizzell. Good to see you, Nell, and Shitij, Kapur. Always lovely to see you, Dr. Kapur. Have a great evening, a wonderful weekend. I'm back with you next week. Good night.